I feel like between these flags here, I should start my fellow Americans. But this isn't kind of a State of the Union. This is more kind of a state of the data roundtable. So this is going to be sort of a broad overview of a lot of the topics that we've been talking about both today and yesterday, particularly as concerns the question of policy. So again, my name's Andrew Schrock. I'm an educator and author and researcher, and I live in Long Beach, California. That's why I have my little Long Beach pin here to represent Long Beach. And here to my left is Marcel Porras, and to my right is Dr. Veronica Barassi. And after some discussion, we're just going to go and introduce ourselves, I think, this time. So Marcel, do you want to take it away?
Yeah, so can everyone see? I just wanted to say hi. Marcel Porras. I am the Chief Sustainability Officer for the Los Angeles Department of Transportation, and I oversee the recently formed Bureau of Transportation Technology, which oversees a lot of the work around new mobility, autonomous vehicles, drones. And a key part of that is that we brought on not just the existing planners and program and analysts that were on my team, but we actually did, I think we should have done a long time ago, which was we peeled off 6 IT professionals from our existing IT department within LADOT to really start looking at building kind of a cross-functional team that can meet the demands that cities are being faced with the emergencies of private mobility.
Hi, just stand up. Hi, I'm Veronica Barassi. I'm an associate professor at Goldsmiths, University of London, and I'm the principal investigator on a project which is called Child Data Citizens, which basically explores all what it means to live in a society where data traces are constantly collected out of individuals, and I focus specifically on the implications, social and political implications of personal data for policy. So yeah, I'm also a visiting scholar at UCLA at the moment. So yeah.
Great, thank you so much for those introductions and for joining me here today for what is sure to be an interesting discussion. So I sort of I describe myself sometimes as a recovering academic. So in the spirit of being an academic, I'm going to try and set the stage with a little bit of historical context and statistics to give us a little bit of background on data. And in particular, the idea of using data for the public good and how to engage the public in a lot of policy making efforts. So, you know, we can talk about data going back quite some time, but, you know, one of the points that I kind of trace it back to is Frederick Taylor and sort of the dawn of scientific management theory, and a lot of the ways that he would use data to collect data about how long people spent on particular tasks in industrial work. So this sort of is where a lot of our notions about sort of efficiency kind of come from. A lot of that still is kind of with us today, where we're trying to use data to improve the way that government functions and to make decisions and to incorporate it into the various internal processes that occur inside of government. But then also kind of since that point, you know, more recently in 2013, Obama's executive orders around open data drew attention to data as an issue of public concern and community well-being. So in 2015, I advised a survey empowering the public through open data by the research group Civic Tech USC, and we surveyed representatives from 88 incorporated cities in LA County, and indeed some people in this room even. And at the time, 18 cities had open data plans and were interested in using data to improve transparency and solve entrenched public problems, but that was still kind of balanced with internal efficiencies. Since that point, even just a few years ago, it seems like the landscape has changed yet again, both giving a dose of reality and bringing new players into this open data kind of ecosystem. I think the dose of reality is that data policy requires work to unlock benefits. I think early on, you know, a few years ago, the idea around data was sort of like, you know, you would open a drawer and there the data would be, you know, and you would use it. It would just sort of be freely available. But it actually requires kind of work to create, collect, and analyze. And also, it's important, as Veronica is going to talk about, the public idea of data, how we think about data, and how the public thinks about data is also informed by, various scandals, such as Facebook monetizing data without users' knowledge. And the public is also evaluating fears of their personal data being used in potentially harmful ways, in addition to kind of the aggregate data that we have access to being used for ways that improve public well-being. And then there are also new players like open data portals like LA Counts, who focus on improving community health and equity across Los Angeles County. And they're really actively involved in aggregating data and pairing it with a hyperlocal news presence to give a more robust framework for activating a culture of service around data. So, I think this is an interesting time for us to sort of revisit the question of data policy, and in particular with an eye towards reaching out to the public and addressing their concerns. So with that, I'll just sort of pose the question. So how should we ethically shape data policy? How do you think that kind of should happen? And where do we go from here?
So another part that I left out of my bio is like, I'm a reformed urban planner. For the last 10 years, actually 4 years ago, I moved over to the Department of Transportation, but prior to that, I was a policy staff for City Council member Eric Garcetti, and then on his team, in his transportation team when he became mayor, and then transitioned over to the Department of Transportation. And so, for us, for the way I had been trained really to look at data was really a question that's kind of solve like really robust, like kind of planning problems around like how do we resolve equity, or how do we solve affordability? And so part of the early research methods and training where like I remember just you got to go to I even forgot, the doctor would know, I think the research methods where you have to sign off if you're going to do surveying of individuals, and you got to go to this office on campus and make sure that all your survey questions that was kind of like my beginning.
Yeah, that's the Institutional Review Board.
The IRB, that's right.
I know that one, Recovering Academic. Yeah.
And so that was kind of like my foray as a planner into it. And then again, how do you solve these questions? I think, but also the kind of the practical application of like solving real world issues and just tracking. I think a couple of the early examples working in the city council office was really a program to actually reduce graffiti, right? Because like what was one of the things that people really cared about in the council district? And it was like, well, how do we actually make a tangible impact on reducing graffiti and tie that to like, community engagement and empowering and getting people's brushes and paints? And so that was kind of like the first part of it. And I think that with like kind of those early like hands-on experience, you're like, wow, this can be pretty powerful in communicating stories and achievements and measuring initiatives that we're doing. I think I still remember, certain things like we reduced tags in the district by 30%, right, over year to year. And literally we would get out every year and go get in cars and go around and do a count of the district. The other part was we tripled the number of parks in the city council, right? And it was something that we were very metrics based about how we do that. And in some instances, I remember like, whoa, I think we're being kind of creative about how we're counting a park, right? And so that was also another example of like, oh, wow, how you can use data to interpret, to do storytelling. I think fast forward, I think that where I see myself right now in the city, for those of you who don't know, new mobility, one of the main things that we're managing right now is this influx of scooters, right? And so, one of the things that we did as part of the permitting system was require, for the first time, a data standard, a data specification that companies had to communicate their data in near real time to the city so that we could know and have a bird's eye view of where everything was. And that, I think, that process, I think, has created a lot of learnings for me as someone who's a planner or someone who's in transportation, because I'm not just doing it for the public benefit, or to do future planning about, vehicle miles traveled and like levels of service and transportation demand management, all these catchy transportation like theories. It was literally about how do we actually know what the hell's going on our streets, right? And so I think starting to capture that data and look at things through a active management of our public right-of-way without kind of starting to think about the long-term planning efforts, which I was so used to and accustomed to thinking about. But I think in terms of kind of the ethics question, I think one of the things that we've had to start dealing with is that we have, very specific data about where these vehicles are. And we learned really quickly that if we're going to require companies to do this, then we have to really ramp up and understand and teach ourselves what are the ethics involved with managing data. And for someone from a transportation background, it was something that I was like, how do we engage with this, right? And so I think really quickly we had to build a team and reach over and look at the different learnings in the city, right? And so how do you start engaging your city attorney on privacy, on intellectual property? How do you start bringing, identifying the data folks in the city, right? Because I think for transportation, it may have seemed new, but I think when you think about this, the really sensitive data sets that cities already manage, right? When you think about LAPD, when you think about social services, like in terms of qualifying, where you live, who you are, all these things just kind of point to the fact that we do have these levels of expertise. It's just a matter of, for us, like connecting the dots rather than trying to kind of reinvent the wheel. So that's kind of where I'm at right now. But I'd love to hear the doctor's perspective as well.
Actually, that's exactly where I am at the moment too. It's basically what I think the key questions around ethics and data is, first of all, we have to clarify, what do we mean when we talk about data? It was fascinating sitting this morning in the panels and listening to people talking about projects and ideas and how to find solutions, and how data was not only profitable, but it was insightful. It was a good thing to have, to manage and to analyze, right? But the problem is that at the moment, we are confronted with enormous databases and that have so many different typologies of data. We're dealing with health data, we're dealing with educational data, we're dealing with home data, we're dealing with a lot of different type of data. And many times when we think about policy and privacy, we talk about all these types of data under the general understanding of personal data. And personal data is usually understood as some kind of personal identifying data, right? So, and so when we think about the ethics of it and the fact that actually we need to develop systems that protect people from the harms and the impacts of data, not only that we actually have systems in place that are efficient and enable us to find solutions with data, but also that data can have serious repercussions. And this was part of the project that I launched in 2016. It's called Child Data Citizen, and it was provocative. It was a provocative name to a project. But the idea was that we are actually living at a historical moment of great transformation. We're not only seeing the emergence of extraordinary new technologies like in artificial intelligence, but we're actually seeing new and much more efficient ways of gathering biometric data and of technologies of identification. We're also seeing the creation of enormous quantities of data and enormous databases that are collected by private entities and are processed by algorithms which we don't really know how they function, right? So we are, and in this, we have to try to make sense of all this kind of techno-historical transformation. And the way in which I made sense of it so far, but I'm not very far with it, but I'm an anthropologist. So what I decided to do, it was to start from the beginning, to start from the individual, from the micro, and thinking about a child today. So if you take, for example, the child today, and not because I'm interested in the child itself, himself or herself, I'm interested in the child as a future citizen. So if you think about a child today, usually you have multiple technologies of data gathering in a child's life. And these technologies can be the technologies of health data collection, like apps and other forms of data monitoring, private or not. You have a lot of forms of data collection and data monitoring in education system. You have now a lot of artificial intelligence technologies within the home. So you're kind of seeing increasingly more that of a single individual from before he or she is born. As a society, we are building an enormous database of a wide variety of traces. And so the idea of the child data citizen is really the question, are we all becoming datafied citizens? And how is this data then used to predict who we are? And how is it used to make decisions about what type of services we have access to and what time? And so these are the questions. And I think that, so when we talk about policy and ethics, my approach is first to question what is it that we talk about when we talk about data, right? If you talk about like kind of aggregated data and statistical data to make the city work, that's amazing, you know. That's how data has always been used. But when we talk about predictive data, like data that actually, so if I go on Amazon and then and I look for something, and then Facebook kind of targets an ad to me saying, you know, like this is what you are, or this is obviously. How is that predictive data? How do we kind of make sense of what's happening in the private sector and in the public sector, and how we understand what we're doing with this data and how we're collecting this data? So these are the questions.
Yeah, great, thank you. And as for me, if Veronica sort of thinks about data from a perspective of an anthropologist, I think about it more from the perspective of someone in communication, because that's the field that I kind of came from. So the question of sort of how do we translate data from, you know, across disciplines, across organizational boundaries, across institutional boundaries. I mean, one thing that I hear a lot when I listen to all of you speak is that a lot of the problems about, for instance, using and interpreting data are not necessarily technological, but they're more organizational and institutional. So to kind of think about getting specific about how we kind of manage those risks, you know, as Veronica was talking about, to get to, you know, some potential rewards for ways that data can actually guide policy. So do you have anything you want to jump in on, or?
Yeah, I was, you know, I was just thinking about like the role of the city in data and engaging kind of the private sector. I think one of the learnings that we've started to have due to our involvement with private mobility companies is really like I think when like Uber and Lyft happened, like when TNCs happened, I think a lot of cities were caught off guard, and we really didn't even know kind of what were the use cases for the data that we wanted, right? And I think and again, going back to what I was saying, is like now we're like, the use case is like, we need to manage our right of way, right? We don't know what the congestion impact is. We don't know what the emissions impact is. And so right now we're saying, you know, when we think about access to the curb, not just scooters, but when we think about delivery vehicles, Uber Eats, Postmates, Amazon, like where is it going to stop, right? And so I think for the city, I think it's this access to data and the requirement of data really, I think, was kind of a pivot back to what the city should be doing, right? In terms of its role as managing the public good and public right of way. And so, and for us, like through this data spec that we created, we're not requiring personally identifiable information. And again, this is an evolving situation, but you know, to one extent, you say like, well, we're not collecting PII, so we should be fine, right? But when you start thinking about like, could you take it a step further and say, well, we don't, if you want to operate on our streets, we don't think the company should be collecting PII either, right? And so like that is a bigger question because, you know, I think to the point of like using data for inference, right? And to infer trends and what's going to happen. I think most recently I was at a happy hour yesterday, and people there was a big debate going back and forth about sidewalk labs, and most recently issuing a project called Replica, which really looks at cell phone data. And some companies have done that already for the wonks planners in the room, like streetlight data or INRIX to measure movement. But I think like the fact that like Google is doing this and trying to monetize it, I think starts begging the question of should we be collecting that data, right? And I think there's a big question. We're so quick to say, yeah, I just agree to all the terms on, for my app because I really want to look at it Instagram or Facebook. And I think there needs to be more thought and I think more advocacy around what you're agreeing to and education of consumers. And so is that the role of the companies? Is it the role of in this case, cities to say, hey, I know that in one of the regulations early on that I saw for scooters, I think City of Austin was pretty prescriptive. They started going down that path of like you have to tell folks what they're opting into, right? It's not a matter. So I think kind of those small steps around this larger discussion. And I think the other thing too is working collaboratively. I think one of the examples that we've learned in regulating scooters is that we didn't really have the capacity or the wherewithal to do it back in 2014, 15 with TNCs, but we started sharing stuff immediately on GitHub. This is what we're thinking, and starting to kind of think about what does a governance structure look like to manage these and start asking these questions, because I think that there is like kind of this need to just educate like nationally and even globally, right? Like how do we start looking at adopting some of the data requirements and standards that the EU is requiring around data? So I mean, these are all questions that I think are starting to happen more and more in real time, and I think it's important for cities to really take that responsibility serious, because I think as I like to say, we have to be the parents in the room and telling folks that like, hey, if you want to access our resources, then these are the rules that you have to play by.
Yeah, I think, we sort of talked about sort of the public-private sort of distinctions, this is probably not a terribly controversial statement in this room, but I believe in public institutions and that they should be strong and well-managed. Give it up for public institutions. So, it's somewhat alarming that I think one of the things we're also talking about is that it's a lot of what we're dancing around is that, data and how it's collected, interpreted, both sort of affect how cities sort of function, and then it also affects sort of the public image of government as a public institution. So, a few months ago, there was a 2018 American Institutional Confidence Poll, and people responded that the most trusted institution in our country is Amazon.com. So yeah, not Google. I don't know where Google was, but I think this sort of is both a little bit disturbing that it wasn't sort of universities or libraries, but a private company. But it sort of does make sense though, because people sort of have everyday interactions with a company that they see as bringing things to them, being good with delivery, kind of, very much in the same spirit that we're, government institutions are supposed to kind of be involved with kind of service delivery. I think that's also one of the challenges when we're sort of talking about sort of functionality that's not disassociated with sort of the public image problem. In fact, they're kind of tightly wound up with a lot of new players. And Amazon isn't sort of alone either. We can go on and on. Apple sort of has rebranded its stores as town squares, and Facebook, it says it's a community, and or even a government at times. It sort of goes on and on. So I think this is part of the challenge that we're sort of confronted with how we're sort of trying to bolster government and the things that we do that improve public life.
Yeah, I agree. I think the key question is about asking how are we going to respond to this transformation, right? And how are we going to make sense of the ways in which data is collected and produced? And it has to be a public response. I work a lot with the Data Justice Lab in the UK, and we recently, together with a colleague, we gave a tour also in some of the key universities on the West Coast, like Stanford, UCLA, and so on. And but it was funny because Dr. Densek and I what we were both thinking is that when you think about data, you have to start becoming an expert in the entire system around that data. So if you're talking about health data, you have to know how people have been working in that sector for many years, how data has been shared, and how all this aspect. If you're talking about educational data, that's the same thing, right? So this is the first thing that we are challenged with when we're talking about creating data regulation. And the general data protection regulation in the EU is not doing a good job on that. So they try, like they try because they realized that they needed to protect citizens from the constant buying and selling of their data, and they tried to implement a public response, but still it still has a lot of problems with it. And this brings me back to a reflection that I had in the panel before that was about policy. Which I found fascinating because a lot of the debates involved before were about how do we manage and analyze the data, but how do we guarantee the accuracy of our databases, okay? So this idea of standard and the idea that actually the data that we are actually processing is good data, okay? And this is a key question, especially if in government, we want to make decisions about individuals' lives on the basis of that data, okay? So it's a key political and social question that anyone should ask themselves. My real concern as an anthropologist when I think about data is that data will always be inaccurate and decontextualized. And this is the real problem, especially if you're talking about personal data or coming to conclusions about someone's behaviors or someone's psychology. It's very difficult. So recently, I advised the Information Commissioner Officer in the UK, and I produced a report which is called Home Life Data and Children's Privacy, where I analyzed what's happening with the inclusion of smart home technologies in the home. And I talked about the fact that a lot of the debates at the moment are concerned about personal data. But actually, when you talk about the data that is being collected, especially by companies like Amazon, that's not personal data. In the home, it's home life data. And when you talk about home life data, it means that actually it is a very complex type of data because they're collecting household profiles and they're trying to do it. I mean, Facebook is trying to do it as well because it patented recently the possibility of recognizing who lives with you on the basis of your photos on Facebook. So the idea of profiling households and the idea, so you have all this kind of, but also if you think about home life data, you realize how messy data is. Because people keep on sharing devices. They keep on, it's very difficult to follow, to being profiled according to your digital practices in the home. And the other thing is that most of the time the data collected is out of context. And one of the examples that I use in the report is that, say for instance, that I have an household profile with Alexa. So my children, I have two little girls, my children are on my household profile. And so their name is connected to that household profile. Imagine that Andrew comes over for dinner and he tells me that a friend of his has a child with diabetes. Imagine that I'm an hypochondriac, right? Sometimes I could be. So I start asking Alexa, what are the symptoms of children with diabetes? Is this? And then I'll go on for the next couple of weeks asking these questions, right? And asking for more information. So I would, at a certain point, after keep on asking that, I would be identified as a parent with diabetes interest, okay? But if my child is on my profile, would my child be profiled as someone with diabetes? So these are the questions. And again, all that on the basis of what? Of a conversation that I had with Andrew about someone else. So these are when we think about data, it's the human complexity and of life, and the fact that at the moment we seem so convinced that we can abstract social reality and human behavior and turn it in data points and then make decisions on the basis of those data points. And while sometimes, especially with aggregated data, I say it's very useful for the management of cities, but then when you actually reduce it to predictive analytics and to things like child protection or policing, then the questions at stake are much broader in terms of civic rights and accuracy of interpretations. So.
Great. So that was sort of the home life, and I think that's a very interesting kind of context to think about, both sort of the privacy issues and then also, the challenges of thinking about where data actually comes from, and it actually comes from kind of these very private and oftentimes intimate and complex kind of life worlds. How do we sort of, to bring it back to Marcel, kind of you were talking a little bit about sort of smart cities, right? I mean, is that sort of a term that still resonates with you? Do you think there's something sort of one of my old friends said we shouldn't talk about smart cities anymore, but rather city smartening. So rather than think about embedding sensors in everything, kind of view people and the devices they carry already, so not adding technology and stir, but simply kind of recognizing the assets that we have and trying to improve based on that, more of a bootstrapping model. Might be one example. So, I mean, is this sort of an idea that when we're talking about data, sort of integrated with that, is smart city is still something you come back to, or are you thinking about it in a different way now?
I mean, I think that for us at the Department of Transportation, we're definitely thinking about how do we use technology to improve, our workflows and to improve outcomes of what we're trying to do, which is, manage mobility in the city of Los Angeles. I think that but it's really without a clear goal of that in terms of what you're trying to achieve and understanding the private sector, because I think smart cities technology is largely defined by the private sector saying, here's a product, like cities, you want to be smart, like you should use my product. Or let me pilot it so then I can say that I'm piloting in Los Angeles and go after a next round of funding, so that I can go get, a bunch of other cities. I think it's important for and then the other piece of that is that sometimes they're not even talking to the Department of Transportation, they're talking to elected officials. And they're making pitches to elected officials about how they can become very innovative. Right. And so I think that is really where it's a challenge, and I think incumbent for city departments to really come up with a strategy in terms of what they're trying to get out of these products, right? And articulate kind of a pathway and kind of the rules for how you want to engage companies. Because I mean, I tell my staff now that we're titled the Bureau of Transportation Technology, we get so many cold calls. And so we have to be very clear with how we're using our time and do some inward thinking about what it is that we're trying to achieve. And I think, and some of the things that we're starting to do is help other divisions within our department, right? Because I think really quickly you're just like, wait, what are you doing? what pilot are you running? And it's like, oh, like, have you thought about, that's fine. You actually know what you're trying to achieve, but there may be more companies out there that can offer that. I mean, I think to kind of cap that off, I think one of the things that we started doing, is we're going less and less to like planning conferences, and we're going more and more to events like the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas to understand what companies are selling, right? And to get with them so that we can help influence their work stream early on and say, hey, we're a city, we want to know what you're trying to pitch, and like let's maybe co-create the product you're trying to design and the problem you're trying to solve.
Yeah, I mean, some of my work deals with the idea of organizational capacity as well, which has been around for quite some time. It may not be that hip anymore, but I still think that's a lot of what we're doing in this room and over the last 2 days is we're really trying to incubate and get and grow capacity, inside of government for doing these types of tasks and for having this kind of awareness, such that, that expertise, these processes, these relationships will, be able to strengthen government as a whole, I think. So maybe we have about 10 minutes left. Maybe we want to take a few questions from the crowd. If you're near, I don't think we had a mic set up. So maybe if you wanted to have a comment, could you come up to the podium there and then just turn the mic on? Uh-oh.
No mic?
Oh, it's the voice button with the
person
with the audio
Hello.
coming out of his
Okay.
mouth. There we are.
Hi. One of the things I think about a lot in terms of this is DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, and kind of haunts me that we collected all of this important data from undocumented and vulnerable communities, and I don't have any information about what's happening with it now, but I trust ICE as far as I can throw them. So what would you, like, hindsight's 2020, like what would you, other than like telling us, like, government employees to, you know, talk to the communities that are involved in it, which we did, like, and get advice from them, like what kind of questions should they have been pushing on or asking on when they were thinking about embarking upon this?
Whoa.
I know. Does anybody want to answer that question for us? I don't know, but this is many times when people like, I used to, my previous work was focused a lot on digital citizenship and digital participation, right? And so I come from a very different field than children. And so all of a sudden, when I started talking about children, everybody was like, especially in academia, that's what we do, we just talk to each other. But people were like, why did you turn to children? What are you doing? You've always been about the citizens. And I was like, well, because if we don't think about the data that is actually produced and collected about the individual citizen today, we are not going to be able to think about our democratic futures. So, and that refers back to your question about DACA. I think the real problem with data is that it's there and it can be used in many different ways. And maybe it's collected with one intention, but then eventually it could be kind of turned against us in many different ways. And the problem at the moment as citizens and across the globe, I think, is because with the rise of tech giants, we have no control whatsoever of the data. So I work with a lot of families in the UK and in Los Angeles, and London, Los Angeles. And then again, a lot, it's not that much because it's an ethnographic project. So I actually go in depth with the families. But what I ask them is like, do you read the terms and conditions? And they're like, no. Why? And they're like, and also, what choice would I have? What choice would I have? Like, so, and they give me so many different examples of the fact that actually now they find themselves forcibly coerced into signing up with terms and conditions. So because they don't have a choice, the school board, the facial recognition at airports, there is so many different ways in which data is collected. So to go back to that question, I don't know how to answer that question. So I don't know. I really don't know. The hope is what I've seen this morning here. It was that, like, I know this sounds really bad, but I come from academia and I don't have that. I have a little bit of contact with civil servants, but not that much. And what I was so intrigued, and certainly not in the States. I always worked in the UK. So, but what I was so intrigued by today is that everyone is actually really motivated by a good idea of what they want to do. And usually it's a very democratic, and it's a really kind of trying to find a solution, right? So, and I believe in that. So I think that that's the only thing that we can believe in. But the problem is that these databases are there and we are collecting and we're making them and we don't know how they're going to be used. So
I think it's actually a good example of what you were kind of saying, that kind of data cannot be removed from, you know, the context in which it's collected. So, you know, data, you know, particularly about race and ethnicity, you know, carries with it in its movements where it, you know, and you can't necessarily count on being able to curtail those flows, right? And, you know, I also think, you know, we've in a way been here before, you know, in terms of the ways in which kind of government data has been, in my opinion, unethically used. And we're also, you know, historically a lot of examples, but then also we're kind of in this moment too, where, you know, the question is being debated. I haven't checked the court, you know, what's going on in the courts, you know, in the last week or two, you know, but the question on whether citizenship should be collected in terms of, you know, the census and sort of the repercussions of that happening. You know, and I think, you know, there are a lot of kind of well-justified, you know, concerns about that, particularly if we look at how census data, you know, about Japanese Americans were used. So, you know, these are, I think, good questions, you know, and it kind of draws into focus, I think, you know, we do have control over how to do these things. You know, we do have some agency in that. And sometimes it's at the point of collection, right? We can say we don't want to collect that data. Sometimes it's, in the last panel, there were a lot of discussions about, for instance, clarity in terms of how data should be used when, handling HIPAA data, handling medical data. I think these are all sort of options that we should think about, but the problem is that there's not kind of like we're saying, one type of data does not equal another type of data. And there's just so much kind of moving constantly. It's sometimes difficult to come to grips on it when we don't really have these established, either workflows or sort of democratic institutions for citizens to kind of be involved in these processes.
I think we should do another question. Anybody else?
We should. We have time for one more question. Feel free to ask a tougher question. That was really easy. Yeah. Oh no, you can go at your little podium. It's like the person's face with audio coming out of the face. There you go.
Okay. My background is actually within the cybersecurity field, and then I transitioned into government within the last couple of months. And so it's really interesting to see kind of like how the government or a local government as well as business, they're using data. And I'm a little interested in like learning or kind of hearing your guys' perspective on policies or how policies are being developed as far as security is concerned, because we do live in a digital age right now where everything, like you mentioned, is being every type of data is being collected, and it's being used now in ways that were kind of unimaginable before, with artificial intelligence systems developing things such as like deep fakes and other situations where it can basically manipulate individuals or cause harm to them. And I'm just wondering how is government tackling that problem? Because I don't hear much about policies being developed from a security standpoint. So I'd like to get some background in that if you can.
I don't have a good answer on that, and it's not because I don't think the work is being done. It's just I haven't been involved in the work. I think there are probably, and if there's someone in the room who actually has an answer to that because they're working on that type of stuff, I would encourage them to speak up. But so for us, like in terms of how we manage data, like we have citywide working groups that establish like data handling policies. We have IT professionals, right, who don't really care what I do with the data. Their just job is to make sure that we're protecting the data. City council approves a lot of these larger policies in the city of Los Angeles, and there is an information technology subcommittee of the city council that this type of policies would go through and get routed through. I'm unclear on how sophisticated the understanding of it is, but that's not to say that there isn't, because I know that there are some council members who are pretty tech savvy, and that usually, when it gets to the city council, it's pretty kind of high profile. And public comment allows for people to kind of weigh in and help shape how those policies are adopted.
So in your perspective, do you see that there is work basically being done on the unknowns that can cause harm later on in society, as far as the digital world that we live in today?
A lot of the work going on around the cyber seems to be at a very sort of high federal level, simply because that's sort of where a lot of those kind of concerns live. I haven't seen altogether too much at a local or state or county level. But maybe next time we do this, we can invite you up here. We could have used a cyber expert up here. That seems to be one thing that is still of increasing concern, and yeah, definitely we'll have to think about in the future. So unfortunately, we're out of time, but if you could join me in thanking our panelists.
Thank you.